If most governments were fiscally responsible, if the prospect of global conflict was completely zero, and if people's confidence in the stability of the present regime was entirely perfect, then there'd be no reason for Bitcoin to exist. But we don't live in that world, right? So that's like the predicate kind of context for why I think it's important to take seriously what might be considered quite like outside the box or unorthodox ideas like a future Bitcoin reserve. And I would say there's like three main benefits that could accrue to the United States from establishing a future Bitcoin reserve. So the first is just...
Matthew Pines is the Director of Intelligence at Sentinel-1 Strategic Advisory Group and a National Security Fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute, specializing in the intersection of Bitcoin, emerging technologies, and policymaking.
With over a decade of experience in national security and tech risk, he brings academic expertise from his Masters in Philosophy and Public Policy from LSE, and a Bachelor's in Physics and Philosophy from Johns Hopkins.
I don't actually like the idea of that we're going to sell down our debt using Bitcoin. That sort of defeats the purpose. Like, we don't really need to pay down our debt. We just need to make our debt more sustainable. And essentially, Bitcoin provides essentially a low-cost option value that over time essentially can help maybe reinforce the embedded expectation about the future sustainability of our debt, because we have this asset on the books that is essentially inverted, has an inverse relationship to that debt creation, right? We produce more treasury securities, Bitcoin tends to go up. So I would say it's more likely than not that we will get an executive established Bitcoin reserve.
Hey guys, so back with another episode, this time with Matthew Pines from the US directly. So Matthew, cool to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Nice. Yeah, I've been following you like many others I get on my podcast for quite some time. You've been quite vocal about Bitcoin, geopolitics, and then some other interesting things that we might not get to talk to you about today. But yeah, just very interesting to now finally talk to you. Maybe if you could quickly introduce yourself, that would be great. Yeah.
Certainly, yeah. So I wear a few hats. Professionally, my main gig is I'm the Director of Intelligence at Pinnacle-1 Strategic Advisory Group, which is kind of the geopolitical and cybersecurity risk advisory arm of Sentinel-1, which is a publicly traded cybersecurity company. So first proviso, these are my personal views, not those of my employer. And so I've had a background doing kind of national security work for most of my career, essentially assessing emerging technology, worst case scenarios, et cetera. And then more recently advising all private sector clients, usually multinationals or critical technology firms that are sort of at the intersection of geopolitical and cybersecurity risk, trying to help them navigate kind of the shifting global landscape, all things emerging technology, geopolitical risk, kind of, and what that means for their business strategy. So that's like my main gig. I've also been supporting the Bitcoin Policy Institute since it was founded almost 4.5 years ago now, where I'm been a national security fellow, and then recently helping out as the head of strategy for them as they start to ramp up their operations. And so there I focused a lot of my research and a sort of policymaker engagement at sort of the intersection of Bitcoin, national security, and geopolitics. Trying to think around these various corners about where Bitcoin might be going in the next few years, and how it might start to play a larger role on the geopolitical stage, and start to interact with more sort of strategic level questions across these different domains. So that now is obviously becoming slightly more salient. So those are kind of my two hats. I try to bring whatever thoughts I have to bear on that question, and you can ask me, I'll riff.
Great. No, that's amazing. Yeah, just interesting to hear that, because like I'm a person probably not as professionally as you, but I'm a layman. I'm trying to understand what's happening in the world, like geopolitics and everything, and also macroeconomics, just like these big shifts that are seeming to be happening nowadays. And often if I talk to my family members or friends, they're like, dude, it's interesting, but it's so not practical. Maybe get yourself a proper job, do something practical. And now you are telling me that you do this for a living. So maybe just quickly, is that an argument you ever hear, or would you say, no, it's actually the most practical thing that you should be talking about, because these shifts are so instrumental and essential, in the end?
I mean, my career was not like something I planned. It was entirely just happenstance and sort of going where the wind took me and sort of saying yes to various opportunities. And so I've managed to carve out like a relatively interesting niche. It's hard to say how someone could like start from scratch and do this again. Like I would not be able to describe a template for this. But yeah, I mean, in general, right? Like geopolitics and emerging technology, I think going to be, like the two dominant forces that are going to shape our world in the next few years, right? The intersection of these shifts that are potentially going to radically disrupt the kind of basic mental models that have been implanted in a lot of like existing leadership, both in national governments as well as sort of corporate sort of executive suites. A lot of those individuals kind of got to those positions over the past 30, 40 years, kind of climbing certain sort of technocratic and meritocratic hierarchies, both in and out of the government, where there's a certain baseline assumption around kind of the structure of global politics, the sort of background trend in terms of technology, and the basic architecture of the global monetary order has not really changed, right? There's been, obviously lots of dramatic developments, say the development of the internet, smartphones, et cetera. But we're seeing, I think, a sense that's now becoming more and more concrete, and now being baked into a lot of those people's assumptions about the future, that some of those sort of pillars of strategic stability may not be as sound as they thought, and potentially, expose the global system to tail risks, to disruption. So a lot of my background was like thinking about sort of low probability, high consequence events, things that you hope wouldn't happen, but you had to like prudently plan for in the case that they did. Right. So most people don't like thinking about, those bad day scenarios like pandemics or, global, war or massive cyber attacks or terrible hurricanes or earthquakes or terrorist attacks or, think of the litany of terrible things that can happen. The government has to like plan for those things and try to like put in place mechanisms and systems to mitigate the consequences if they do occur, and obviously try to prevent them from occurring in the first place. That's just a role of government. It's also increasingly a role of a lot of private companies that are taking on kind of quasi-sovereign functions now. And so this idea of like, Google, Microsoft, these are like, essentially critical infrastructure. Lots of companies are essentially critical infrastructure, and our society is becoming increasingly digital. And so these, these systems are now also, sources of kind of systemic risk. But there's also like, similar trends that create, you might call like sort of right tail, right? Systemic opportunities. Right, things that are not essentially in everyone's sort of central base case for the future. But history tells us that things kind of come in from both ends of the tail, both really bad things and also things you didn't anticipate that have a lot of upside. And I think most people spend their day to day just thinking about the middle parts of the distribution, because that's mostly rational for most people. But that tends to make you blind to the potential for things coming in from the tails. And so maybe just psychologically in my professional training, I've been more focused on those each sides of those tails and trying to think about what could be coming in from those sides of the tails that would materially change people's baseline assumptions about the future. And again, not making predictions, but saying like asking the what if question and then trying to get the ball rolling on, serious policymaker attention on it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. That's why I've been following you, because I feel like I have, maybe on a lower level, but I have the same feeling and the same strive in me, to go for these low probability events and then think about them. And that's exactly what then these other people, that go, that they day by day life and they don't care about this. They're like, how can this be even relevant? The probability is so low. And then all of a sudden it changes and they're like, wow, crazy. And that's also where Bitcoin now kind of helps me in that regard, because I've been grappling and thinking about Bitcoin for quite some time, and lots of that period, like people were just like, dude, it doesn't even matter, and now there's some sort of vindication almost, that now everyone is talking about it, and people were like, after all, okay, maybe it did make some sense, or to think about these low probability events actually happening and coming to fruition in real life. So that's very interesting. But maybe I want us to start us off actually with this quote, by Friedrich August von Hayek. It's an Austrian economist, and yet such an interesting quote. And I think it suits you well as well, because you're not one of these guys, because he said, nobody can be a great economist who is only an economist. And I'm even tempted to add that the economist who is only an economist is likely to become a nuisance, if not a positive danger, And I feel like this is really relevant to Bitcoin as a whole, and now also about this topic that I would like to address with you, the strategic Bitcoin reserve. which is on everybody's mind right now. So as we understood, you are not an economist, but I feel like you have a great understanding of economics. And so, I just like to throw this quote at you. What do you think of this, and how relevant is it in today's world? Not only Bitcoin, but just generally.
Certainly. I mean, in environments where global peace is relatively assured, which has been, kind of the basic expectation since the fall of the Soviet Union, and most of our lives, and most of kind of the folks that are running kind of most institutional systems, kind of that's been their experience for the past 30 years is, in globalization was able to flourish, and you get a sense that, business is good, right? Like, and then you can bake into your macro models kind of an assumption that there is not going to be war, there's not going to be great power conflict, trade routes aren't going to be suddenly disrupted, right? Major critical infrastructure isn't going to be subject to, state attack, right? There isn't going to be, a whole bunch of externalities imposed on the global economic and financial system from sort of non-rational actors from the perspective of traditional sort of economic modeling. That if everyone was just, out there buying and selling and trying to do Ricardian comparative advantage and optimizing business models, then of course this is what the result. But the world is not like that, right? It's like physicists, you have to assume a frictionless plane, right? You sort of assume a spherical cow. It's like in order to model a system using some sort of measures of abstraction like we do in physics. My undergrad was in physics. You have to make certain assumptions, right? You have to sort of abstract away a lot of the sort of crude, messy detail of reality in order to try to come up with some model, right? That's what humans like to do. And so economists are really good at that. Economists are really good at trying to abstract away a lot of the messy details about human society and geopolitics and war and conflict. And that's just the geographic features of our presence on the planet. And obviously the foibles of human psychology, especially at national leadership level, in order to make their models, right? And that's fine. Like models are good, right? But they're only as good as the models they're only as good as how much abstraction you can kind of connect to the real world. And so I don't throw away the entire discipline of economics. I think it's very valuable. But I think they're now coming into a realization that the structure of the global system is creating, increasingly challenging the relevance of those models, right? Some of the assumptions that were baked in maybe aren't as safe anymore. And I think at the end of the day, like the global monetary and financial system is ultimately downstream of a certain geopolitical balance of power, right? Like it's ultimately power that sets, the domain for trade, right? For who's in whose orbit, who's going to control what trade routes. Where are natural resources, preferentially exploited by what great power centers, and this is sort of the lesson of human history, right? Unfortunately, and this is the regime we've grown up with. We've assumed essentially the post-war era, most of the global system essentially was organized around kind of this bipolar, fight between U.S. and the Soviet Empire, and then when the Soviet Empire collapsed, essentially. The new regime that we sort of have been living under the last 30 or so years has been essentially a sort of triangle where kind of the G7 sort of economic and military and sort of legal power structure kind of dominated the global system, right? So obviously the U.S. at the top, but essentially the G7 sort of dominate sort of global sort of economies as well as sort of nuclear military power, sort of set the basic rules, right? And dominated most of those institutions. And then you had essentially OPEC Plus, dominate sort of the marginal production of energy and natural resources, right? So Russia plus the Gulf countries, and obviously, Venezuela, et cetera. And then you had China, rapidly emerging to take up like that third leg, which is sort of manufacturing. So you have like credit, sort of money, and sort of the legal sort of global rule of law enforced by U.S. military hegemony, with sort of OPEC plus sort of natural resources and commodities. And then China as essentially the dominant sort of manufacturing and production center. And when those like three legs of the global sort of system were kind of at least in frenemy mode, right? We're not actively like competing with each other and like actually, in proxy wars, then the global system can kind of work pretty well, right? You can have, you're going to have disputes, you're going to have frictions, but you can have a functioning global economic trade and financial system. And that I think we're seeing stress come into play on all three legs of that stool, whether it's the Russia sanctions, attempted oil price cap, whether it's, the technology containment against China, kind of the quote decoupling or de-risking from China, as well as like an increasing convergence of some diplomatic and realignments in the Middle East, vis-a-vis China and Russia, and it's kind of becoming a much more complicated sort of multi-alliance system. Whereas people try to figure out who actually has what relative power balance in a much more competitive global environment. And of course, that's going to then have downstream effects on the monetary system, right? Like, because the lesson in history is that essentially the dominant power sets the rules, and part of the rules is here's the global sort of financial sort of architecture, and we now have the ability to essentially gate access to that financial architecture as well as surveil it, right? So we dominate the global sort of economic network, and therefore that gives us essentially choke point and surveillance power. And we have been very effective thus far at sort of wielding that sort of sanctions weapon. But now we're sort of reaching a point where maybe it's not as effective as it had been against, say, smaller players in that network. Now we're thinking about not just Russia, but China. And China, of course, is a much different beast, and is a much more strategic level kind of peer power in the global system that has a very particular set of strategic objectives that it's trying to achieve. And so this is really like a much different environment than most of, say, economic models have assumed. They're trying to do macro, right? That if fundamentally you can do macro, but if you're trying to like macro to figure out like the basic architecture of the global system, and this is like if you're trying to set interest rates, right? Like President Xi can make a decision that can affect how the Fed thinks about interest rates, right? And or like there's a great book by Paul Tucker, who was the number 2 at the Bank of England, and he did like swap lines, which is essentially the issuance of sort of dollar liquidity, are fundamentally like geopolitical decisions, right? So during March 2020, like it was who's going to get a swap line, right? Is it only our friends, India, right? Who gets access to these different liquidity facilities like the FIMA repo facility or the standing repo facility? They sound very technical and arcane, and they're managed by a bunch of sort of monetary economists and technocrats at these institutions like the Fed or the central banks. But at the end of the day, it's like, who's in our club? Who are we going to give access to these dollar swap lines? Who's going to get access to these repo facilities? And those are fundamentally geopolitical decisions, and they're going to have geopolitical effects. And so this idea that you can sort of compartmentalize these questions and just treat it as just an analytic model is just no longer the case.
Yeah, exactly. Well described. So much to unpack here, but you're exactly right. I mean, this is something that I've grown to kind of appreciate as well, that there is so much more to these questions than just like coming at it from one sort of compartment, so to say. You really have to kind of just think cross disciplinary, so to say, to understand these questions, and maybe not to be picking on somebody, because I want to zero in on this, when it comes to Bitcoin. But there was this discussion recently going on, on X, and this, I think, was an economist. He used to work for the Federal Reserve, David Andolfado, I think is his name, Italian name, and he was really asking the question to now kind of swift the topic to this Bitcoin strategic reserve thing, okay, what's the point of this all? Why does this even make sense? And then I also tried to kind of ping him and try to understand how's he thinking. And he was exactly thinking in this type of model, like G7, the US monetarily sovereign, and nothing can ever happen to the US. We have our own money, and we will create it ever. And there's nothing that can kind of stop. But that's maybe a little bit somewhat an exaggeration, but I still had this feeling that he's coming from this angle, and sort of, if you have this angle and you believe that nothing could ever disrupt this, then obviously, it doesn't make sense to kind of take Bitcoin on the balance sheet. It doesn't even make sense to take gold on its balance sheet, for a state. And that's also what he agrees to, So that's just something, that I found interesting, to see that sometimes people come from way different angles, so to say, and now, but I think, as you neatly described, because the world is being disrupted, or at least like it's changing exponentially because of all these technologies, I think you have to factor in more things, in answering these sorts of questions. But maybe, like just this Bitcoin strategic reserve question now, it's been the topic of the day among Bitcoiners. I think we've seen a lot of momentum pick up. Can you summarize the most important recent developments for us?
Mm-hmm. Certainly, yes. And just to go back to the last point, like I would agree, like if most governments were fiscally responsible if the prospect of global conflict was completely zero, and if people's confidence in the stability of the present regime was entirely perfect, then there'd be no reason for Bitcoin to exist, right? And there'd be no reason, and if governments didn't sort of weaponize the financial system against their own citizens, or other countries, then yeah, Bitcoin's value proposition, the need to consider Bitcoin would sort of be not that strong, right? But we don't live in that world, right? And so it's like, you can assume a world and you can imagine a certain world, and then in that world you can make certain arguments for the state of affairs that you would like to see. But then you have to look at the actual world and then sort of adjust your priors. I think a lot of economists don't live in that world, right? They want to assume the world is a simple place where their models work, and sometimes the world then surprises them. And my background not being an economist, but doing essentially contingency planning for the government, like looking around those sort of 1% scenarios, it's like, well, sorry, the government doesn't have the luxury of just assuming Plan A always works, right? Plan A, treasury market, stable forever, do these sort of technocratic fixes with central clearing, trying to regulate other sort of major kind of participants in that market to make them less sources of systemic risk, trying to use geoeconomic levers to make other sources of capital prefer more treasuries on their balance sheet, right? And to just generally speaking, to try to find more buyers of our debt and try to prevent any disruptions to the treasury market. Again, Plan A, that's what I would expect them to do. They should be doing all of that. But Plan B is, what if that doesn't work? What if there's a speed bump, right? And what if that speed bump is specifically being put in place by adversaries looking to take advantage of the strategic vulnerabilities that are created from our fiscal and monetary fragilities, which are real, right? We can't just wish them away, right? Or assume that it's like you're a 22-year-old marathon runner and now you're 45 trying to hit your same pace. It's like you're just not that same guy, right? You have to reckon with reality and then come up with maybe different strategies to keep your position, right? And not just hey, give up, let somebody else run past me. So that's the predicate kind of context for why I think it's important to take seriously what might be considered quite outside the box or unorthodox ideas like a strategic Bitcoin reserve, right? It's only because we're in a very different world that such an idea, I think, even has merit, right? I think a few years ago, it might have been prudent to say this is not a serious policy proposal, right? It's not worth considering. And I think you just have to take a hard look at the actual conditions that are developing in the global system and realize that those are very different and that the world is changing and potentially changing fast. And I'm not saying this means you absolutely go for a strategic Bitcoin reserve, but it means you actually have to take it seriously, right? And that's a lot of people just aren't even doing that, right? They're just sort of dismissing it as just an absurdity, right? Because it just doesn't seem like it would fit within their basic mental models. And so most people don't even get to the point of assessing the pros and cons or the technical implementation or the strategic benefits. They just hear it and it just sounds like a phrase that seems like a joke, right? And so first, I would just say you need to get over that, right? And be like, this is a serious idea. And it's motivated, right, out of this idea that the United States needs to kind of, maintain its global position, right? We are not necessarily assured global leadership just because of some mandate of heaven, right? It's an emergent capability that comes from having a number of different sort of pillars of national strength, right? Our military capacity, our diplomatic influence, our overall growth rate, our productivity, our technological advantage, as well as our existing dominance of the global monetary system. And these are all interrelated pillars of national economic strength. And all of those pillars are potentially going to be heavily contested, if not sources of economic and strategic vulnerability over the next few years. And so Bitcoin is potentially a relevant thing to consider in light of that context. So again, a lot of throat clearing, a lot of setting the table, but sometimes you have to even just do that before, making a narrow, straight down the case argument for something like a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And I would say there's three main benefits that could accrue to the United States from establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve, right? And this is not, obviously there's sort of a matter of scale and implementation. So I'll speak about it just more kind of conceptually. So the first is just pure signaling, right? That Bitcoin, is an open source monetary protocol, doesn't necessarily carry with it any political ideology, but it happens to be aligned with a certain ethos around the world, right? This idea of individual autonomy, right, relative to, say, extractive or repressive governments, right? It tends to provide access to sort of financial services and an emerging store of value that is difficult for governments to inflate or seize away. And to the extent that America, in its sort of long history, stands for individual liberty around the world, stands for democracy stands for the individual relative to an oppressive or extractive state. The sort of alignment of Bitcoin with American values and our push for human rights around the world is positive. So we endorsing Bitcoin, essentially saying Bitcoin is a good thing enough that we want to hold some of it, essentially provides a wind in the sails of that development around the world. And so it aligns with our interests, aligns with our values. And just that signal alone would be positive. It would likely also stimulate the existing advantage that we already hold in terms of the most secure and trusted Bitcoin exchanges. We have Bitcoin, treasury companies like MicroStrategy, on our stock markets. We have maybe a plurality of the global hash rate. We have, the largest single Bitcoin holdings by a government. We have probably maybe the most actual Bitcoin held by individuals within our jurisdiction. So the extent that you send a positive signal as a government that we're going to support Bitcoin, we think Bitcoin is good, that just sort of reinforces the existing advantages that we've had, as well as sort of supports the adoption of the network around the world, where it essentially stands for our values and our interests relative to, say, the digital authoritarianism that our adversaries are trying to impose, right? Sort of central bank digital currencies and a digital sort of authoritarian stack that's highly surveilled. That's all about reinforcing the power of often sort of one-party regimes to extract and oppress their people. So just that alone, just that minimal establishment of a Bitcoin reserve, just taking the existing coins that are not sort of legally encumbered, say through various legal seizures, that would be its own kind of a positive benefit to the United States. The second sort of potential benefit would be a little bit more strategic, right? Once this is kind of like a nonlinear thing, right? In a world where nobody thinks Bitcoin could be a global neutral reserve asset, then it's kind of a stable state. When you shift to a regime, or at least some subset of key actors in that global system believe that it could be, especially in the near future, a global neutral reserve asset, then the game theoretic dynamics shift, right? And I think we might be in that shift at the moment. And it's unclear, right? You never know exactly, right? But there's strong reason to believe that major pools of capital, especially say in the Middle East, the Gulf countries in particular, are already moving to establish a meaningful sort of position in Bitcoin for their national portfolio assets. And that could precipitate a trigger to other countries, say in Africa, throughout South Asia, et cetera. Again, not great powers moving like China or the European Union or Britain or Japan, et cetera, but meaningful new elements of kind of this of the global system that control trillions of dollars of capital, right? The sovereign wealth funds in the Middle East. I mean, you're based in Switzerland, so I'm pretty sure you know how much money's there. Maybe 3-4 trillion in official sort of sovereign wealth reserves, maybe another few trillion in non-official sovereign wealth assets, and then of course you have the actual foreign exchange. So that's a large amount of capital, and the indications are that they may be ready to move soon, if not already. And so the United States has to look at that and be like, okay, what will be the potential effect if they move first in size and then other countries follow suit? Could that be, put us at a relative disadvantage? And so if we think that's going to happen, then we need to take actions now to ensure we don't get front run, right? That the existing advantage that we have doesn't get eroded. So that would be an argument to sort of scale up the Bitcoin reserve to some size that you think would, you would want to calibrate to retain the U.S.'s overall advantage, to sort of act as a downside hedge against some other disruption to the global monetary system. And then the third kind of major bucket, this is a little bit more strategic long-term, is essentially option value, providing essentially ballast for the U.S.'s balance sheet over the longer term, right? Right now, we're committed to, essentially peacetime deficits of 7, 8, 9% of GDP, which is enormous, right? Very, very unsustainable. Everyone recognizes this is a huge problem. And of course, that creates issues with inflation. If the government essentially is having to print treasury securities just to finance itself, we're spending more on interest costs than on the defense budget, which is not a great position to be in when your principal adversary can borrow money at basically half your interest rate and is building ships and missiles as fast as they possibly can to aggressively challenge your global position, and also is willing to hold your critical infrastructure, including your financial infrastructure, at credible risk in a conflict or crisis situation. So going back to my earlier point, we are in a position of potential strategic vulnerability as a result of the fiscal and monetary fragilities that we already have, and those fragilities will become more acute over the coming years. And currencies, fiat currencies, et cetera, essentially exist in there's like two equilibrium values, right? A positive value and a zero value, right? Just that's sort of like basic economic modeling, like 101. Like there's like this two equilibrium for any fiat currency regime. Right now, we're in a positive value, right? And of course, it seems absurd to think about that could shift. Usually takes a massive shock, right? But those massive shocks like happen in history, right? We have had world wars. We've had global pandemics. We've had a lot of major disruptions. We've seen, global reserve currencies fall. I'm not saying that's a prediction, but it is a risk. And you've had senior policymakers talk about it as a risk. Like it is a concern. It's not necessarily a concern tomorrow, but 5, 10, 20 years, the government has to put in place plans now that ensure U.S. dominance over the long haul. And that's where I think Bitcoin could play this interesting role, which is answering the question, the what if. What if Bitcoin stays, say, always and ever below gold as a global neutral reserve asset? Then, okay, it's just your portfolio diversifier. Maybe it makes sense to have some, like everybody else needs to have some now as it becomes like, a $2 trillion asset, a $4 trillion asset, $8 trillion asset, et cetera. People are just going to diversify their portfolios into this new asset. The government has a portfolio of assets. It should diversify, accordingly. It has a lot of gold. It should have, some meaningful proportion of Bitcoin as well, just on that logic alone. But then there's this scenarios where Bitcoin reaches parity with gold or, moves above gold in terms of its total, share of global assets. And that would be a massive strategic disruption to the existing global economic and monetary system. And there's two ways that could happen, right? That could happen because it's mostly offshore pools of capital deciding to sell away from the dollar system and diversify into Bitcoin instead, in which case that would advantage them relative to us. Or it could be, individuals demonetizing gold or demonetizing commodity assets or demonetizing overseas, assets in exchange for Bitcoin and dollar-based stable coins that reinforce U.S. power, right? And so you can imagine a scenario where Bitcoin is monetizing to reach parity with gold or increases relative to gold. And it's either is it reinforcing the advantages of the United States or, undermining the advantages of the United States. And in that question, you want to set expectations now that the U.S. is essentially steering that trajectory in the direction of our advantage, right? That essentially people price in the expectation in the future that you'll be able to take advantage of Bitcoin's future price appreciation because you have a meaningful portion of it on your balance sheet. So it acts essentially as like a stabilizer of expectations, right? I don't like the idea of that we're going to sell down like our debt using Bitcoin because I know that sort of defeats the purpose. It's more you're sending a credible signal that your overall balance of your balance sheet between assets and liabilities, right, is now has this sort of feedback loop where even as you issue more treasury securities, right, Bitcoin will tend to appreciate. And so you're kind of like, you're auto-stabilizing the fiscal balance sheet over the long term. And more importantly, it's about expectations. It's about, okay, if Bitcoin were to then go on this run, maybe because of some geopolitical event or because you have to do, some massive QE in a global crisis, that Bitcoin essentially absorbs some of that liquidity instead of gold or instead of, a run to offshore, jurisdictions or offshore real estate or, God forbid, even the Chinese bond market. And instead, you kind of have directed some of that liquidity into an asset that you already hold on your balance sheet. And so it's a bit of putting in a bit of like a closed loop, right? And that then tends to reinforce expectations that the overall system has a kind of a stabilizer built into it. That's a little bit longer term, a little bit more speculative for sure. But I think, as Bitcoin, it seems absurd to say that when Bitcoin's $100 billion, not so absurd when Bitcoin's 2 trillion, and certainly not absurd if Bitcoin reaches, some meaningful fraction of gold, in which case this is a very, very live sort of geoeconomic question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some great points here. Well made. Like a good convincing case for Bitcoin for sure as Bitcoin reserve. I mean, I want to come back like to this third point, that you just were like neatly explaining and thoroughly explaining to the audience. But maybe just taking a step back real quick. I mean, what some people might be asking themselves is also like, what is a strategic reserve in general? And then also like, what is a Bitcoin strategic reserve? How does that work? You alluded to it. Like, do you keep some Bitcoin on your balance sheet that you already have as a government? Do you buy more? So in your words, where do you see this going? And what do you think is like a proper definition of that?
Certainly. So governments have reserve assets, reserve commodities of all kinds, right? So just take the U.S. government, for example. We have a strategic national stockpile of like medical supplies and like, medical countermeasures and other sort of medical gear. Obviously, during COVID, we learned that the supply chains for those were kind of problematic. So we need to stockpile, right? This in case of emergency, in case we need these assets, we need to be able to have a reliable source of them, ideally already, pre-supplied with the oil, right? We have, a strategic petroleum reserve, and there it's less about the sort of, it's got two functions, right? One is as like the left tail risk mitigation. We have some, supply in case of an acute disruption, but it's also used to embed expectations, and it also used to kind of like control the price as like a geoeconomic lever, right? Because there's also, high stakes negotiations over the supply of oil around the world between OPEC decisions. And, strategic releases from the petroleum reserve essentially are used as a geopolitical sort of lever, right? They're an instrument that the government has as part of its toolkit for sort of geopolitical and geoeconomic activities. And so like reserves that are used maybe built up for one logic, right? Like we need to have it in case of war, often evolve over time, right? To be used in a much more like flexible manner. And so there's lots of, and of course we have like sort of monetary reserve assets like gold and other sort of currency, sort of foreign exchange. So other countries that are not us have to hold essentially dollars, mostly held in sort of short-term sort of treasury bills and maybe, a few, out the curve, because they participate in a global system where dollars are the medium of exchange. And so they have to essentially, especially if they're a surplus nation, they have to recycle their surpluses. And so the current global economic and monetary system is basically designed around a global dollar treasury standard where surplus nations, increasingly, mostly U.S. adversaries or rivals or multi-aligned nations like in the Middle East or Eurasia, have dollar surpluses that we have essentially engineered our economy to absorb, right? So we've created desirable, scarce assets and a permissive sort of financial system that allows those surpluses to flow in. And in exchange, they hold a relatively stable treasury asset. Of course, you've had guests, I'm sure Luke Rome has talked about how that treasury asset may not be so stable. And therefore there's a diversification incentive. But like monetary reserves, especially for the global hegemon, like people are asking, like, why does the U.S. government still have gold, right? Like we can print money, we can print treasury securities. Why do we have, thousands of tons of gold? Like what function does it serve, right? And there's a reason why the government hasn't sold its gold, right? Like, cause they know there is a risk, right? Like people, when push comes to shove, right? At the end of the day, you got to have a backup plan. And in many cases, gold has been the old standby when the global order starts to fall apart. And so, global monetary reserves ideally function as a sovereign store of value, right? And also, for other countries that are not, issuers of that reserve currency, it provides a bit of a buffer in case of sort of dollar funding stress or other economic sort of currency weakness. They can sell those reserves to stabilize their currency to otherwise kind of, mitigate the vicissitudes of the market economy that they're sort of plugged into. And so this is the basic function of reserves in many cases, like either a tail risk hedge for an emergency, a backup plan in case the existing system fails, or essentially as a market buffer, right? To sort of insulate you from the overall volatility in the economic system. I think for the United States, and of course, every government has their own position in this global system. Every government has a different potential argument to make about whether a strategic Bitcoin reserve makes sense for them in different ways. It's not the same argument for everybody. And certainly for the United States, it's a kind of unique argument because we are the existing, geoeconomic and monetary hegemon, right? So there is like a unique set of circumstances that we're trying to think about, preparing for and mitigating with the strategic Bitcoin reserve that maybe don't apply to other actors in this. So yeah, that's, I guess, the TLDR on that.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, you said it, the strategic reserve and some people are thinking about building this up, and I think that's your second point that you also were alluding to, like when you mentioned the convincing case for it. But then you already said it that like some people are arguing for a strategic Bitcoin reserve to help the US government pay down its debt, And there I also have my question marks like, okay, given right now, I would subscribe to this view of David and Alfonso, that I mentioned, that the US is monetarily sovereign nation, and as long as things continue, it doesn't sort of make sense to pay down its debt, and then because also there are these thinkings out there or concepts, where like it was Senator Cynthia Lummis, she proposed to buy like 1 million Bitcoin, over the next 5 years if her bill were to pass. But then, this 1 million Bitcoin, I mean, it would have to appreciate like thousands of percent, to kind of be big enough to kind of, pay down the US debt. I saw this calculation, like 700 trillion would have to be the market value of Bitcoin, to kind of pay it down. So that's what I kind of read, even though it doesn't make sense, but just, does it make sense, paying down the debt? I think you already said that might not be the right argument to cut it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the main argument for a strategic Bitcoin reserve, is to actually pay down the U.S. government debt, to like reduce our debt to zero. For one, like we still exist in a debt-based global monetary system, right? Like credit is the grease by which, the entire global machine runs, right? Like the treasury security is the foundational collateral for like a whole, multi-$100 trillion stack of global financial products, right? And interest rate forwards and derivative swaps. And like the global bond market and the global economic machine runs on debt. It just is, right? So you can be like, that's not a great system, we should change that system. That's a whole separate argument, right? And there's probably like a long way between where we are now and a different fundamental system for the global structure. And a lot of Bitcoiners have, certain idealized visions of what a global system would look like that's based off of hard money. I think that's a fine argument to have. It just doesn't seem relevant to the narrow policy objectives of the strategic Bitcoin reserve over the next 5, 10, 15 years. I think you just bracket those two conversations entirely. And the argument is not that the strategic Bitcoin reserve is going to like be some, asset that the government sort of pumps and dumps, right? We pump it up, and then all of a sudden we sort of say, oh, sorry guys, that was just a trick to like liquidate it all for dollars, right? And then the government's selling, this trillions of dollars of Bitcoin for dollars. Well, who's going to buy that, right? Like the mechanics of that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It's just an actual pay down of the debt. And also, like, we don't really need to pay down our debt. We just need to make our debt more sustainable, right? We also, more importantly, sustainable is not like an objective fact. It's a psychological state, right? And so if people believe that the future growth trajectory of the debt to GDP ratio, meaning the balance essentially of our productivity, our assets, and our debt creation, is that if that's out of whack and politically or geopolitically, it's going to get worse, less stable, then people pull forward that expectation of instability, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is the risk that you're trying to mitigate, right? You're trying to put in place, and essentially Bitcoin provides essentially a low cost option value that over time essentially can help maybe reinforce the embedded expectation about the future sustainability of our debt, because we have this asset on the books that is essentially inverted, has an inverse relationship to that debt creation, right? We produce more treasury securities, Bitcoin tends to go up, right? And if you're on the wrong side of that and you're just creating more and more treasury securities, creating more and more fiscal and monetary fragility, and you have no counterbalancing asset on your books, that people can be like, well, hey, like, what's your plan, right? In case this goes pear-shaped on you, or an adversary makes it go pear-shaped on you, like pushing the Bitcoin into that balance sheet, essentially, again, creates that sort of auto-stabilizing function for future expectations. So I think the whole idea that, I mean, it's like, people like to think in terms of these explicit numbers, right? It's like, there's a certain amount of debt. If we get Bitcoin up to a certain level, it allows us to kind of like cancel out that debt. I mean, that involves a whole different set of mechanical decisions about the government effectively going to move then to a Bitcoin standard, and the whole global system then moves to a Bitcoin standard where you abandon the treasury market. That could happen. It seems like quite a radical, different policy, recommendation. I wouldn't endorse at the moment, especially that may precipitate the very thing you're trying to avoid, right? The policy objective that I would propose, signaling for, is using strategic Bitcoin reserve to reinforce confidence in the long run sustainability of the treasury market, and that you essentially stitch them together as sort of mutually reinforcing financial assets. right? Not that
Yeah.
you're backing the treasury market with gold, but that essentially you're saying U.S. government is good for it, right? And most of the arguments that the U.S. says the U.S. government is good for is that, yeah, we'll just print the money. Okay, well, but then that, in history has shown to be a unstable equilibrium, right? And is vulnerable to situations where, negative feedback loops can kick in. And we've seen examples of this during March of 2020, during COVID, when there was a run on the off-the-run treasury security that normally was a flight to safety, right? In times of recession, people were dumping their treasuries and the dealer balance sheets got clogged and they said, no, we're not taking any more. And the Fed was forced to print $3 trillion of QE in a month, right? And guess what did Bitcoin do? It ran up after that, right? If the U.S. government had Bitcoin on its balance sheet then that massive QE response to an extremely disruptive, global event, would essentially have kind of absorbed some of that, printing on the government's balance sheet, right? As opposed to going into the overall sort of economy. So I think there's arguments to think about the use of these sorts of neutral reserve assets as a form of ballast that can absorb excess liquidity. It also provides sort of an auto stabilizer in crisis events, which seems completely counterintuitive. But we have recent evidence of Bitcoin's price performance after, say, the SVB banking failure or after the Russia sanctions, where it actually went up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, that sounds kind of, to me, as a portfolio manager, it's really like portfolio theory for geopolitical government nation states, who kind of have to think about how to position themselves. And as you said, it's like this classical hedge, because like if there's one thing probably a lot of people agree on is that Bitcoin is like negatively correlated even to treasury debt and just debt in general going up, and then obviously that's also good for Bitcoin. And then again, this is exactly what you would be looking at, as a portfolio manager, so to say. So that's just the thinking applied, like the portfolio management thinking applied to geopolitics or whatever we want to call it, But in one sense, this makes a lot of sense, on the one hand. But then on the other hand, I'm also, and I think you have been somebody who's stressing this as well, thinking about the risks associated with such a move, because then also I'm thinking about this, by adopting a strategic Bitcoin reserve, aren't we also kind of running the risk of disrupting the U.S. Treasury market? Because then there again, because Bitcoin is sort of a hedge monetarily, some people could even think if the U.S. government were to adopt something like this, it's kind of secretly or then also out in the open admitting that Bitcoin is maybe more resilient, than the government and the Treasury market. And that could kind of spark some sort of sell-off and all of a sudden you find yourself nuking the treasury market and something that you don't want to do. So isn't that also a risk, which to me, if I hear it like that, also kind of makes sense. So, and that's why I would get cautious again.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you, right? There is a risk of like YOLOing in and precipitating the run that you're trying to mitigate, right? And this is where it's a matter of scale and signaling clear intent. And yeah, if the government were to go out and buy 4 million Bitcoin or 6 million Bitcoin and say, we're going to buy it no matter what the price is, right? And we're going to print hundreds of billions of dollars in order to buy Bitcoin at any dollar figure. In that scenario, you do risk essentially everyone being like, wait a second, if the global hegemon doesn't trust its own paper money and is instead buying this thing, then why should I keep, using their paper money and their IOUs and instead buy the thing that they're buying? Right, that would be a rational inference to draw from a U.S. government signal that's as clear and as and has that magnitude. Right, so this is why I think it's very important about the nature of the signaling, the nature of the intent, and the scale. Right, that's put in place. That this is not the government essentially abandoning the treasury market. Right, but by all means, it's essentially the government prudently diversifying into an emerging store of value, just like it has large quantities of gold. Nobody freaks out about the fact that the government has a lot of gold because the government's going to, is keeping it in secret for a rainy day when it's going to rug pull the treasury market and then remonetize gold all of a sudden, right? Lots of gold bugs have said this over the years that one of these days the government is going to just monetize gold, $5, $10, $20,000 an ounce, and the treasury market is basically going to be completely demonetized, right? And in fact, the lesson of history though is that that is exactly what happens. Right, over time. Eventually, when governments get to the point where they have a lot of debt that they can't effectively service, either there's global wars that effectively wipe it out through inflation and expropriation, or there's just capital controls and financial repression and, essentially either a euthanasia or a quick execution of the bond market, right? So that may happen regardless of what happens with Bitcoin, right? That's just the nature of the fact that we've gotten ourselves in this position where our debt to GDP ratio, right? We didn't bring it down fast enough after sort of the COVID years, and now it's potentially starting to climb again. That's just what it is, right? You either have to cut that spending, you have to massive, sort of productivity growth miracle, or you're going to see things like Bitcoin essentially sniff out the fact that eventually you're going to have to print the money to make up the difference, right? This is the Luke Roman, Lynn Alden thesis, right? And the government has to try to manage expectations on that. I agree with them, right? This is about how to essentially short circuit that negative feedback loop, And because it's a common knowledge game, it's a game of future expectations. This is all about signaling. It's all about the scale, right? Just like everyone looks at the forward guidance from the Fed. If the Fed came out the next day and said, actually, the inflation target's 5%, well, I guarantee you, the bond market would lose its mind, right? Not because of anything materially happened in the productivity, the economy or some real economy measure. It was just senior officials came out and just radically shifted everyone's expectations about the future, right? And what their policy path was going to be. And so I think you'd have to play the same, strategy with anything like a strategic Bitcoin reserve. Essentially, the government essentially providing geoeconomic forward guidance, right? That we're not going to rug pull the treasury market, but we are going to be prudent, and we're actually going to, be innovative and clever, and maybe adding some additional option value to our balance sheet. And we're not going to YOLO. We're not going to go ham on this thing, and we're not going to essentially precipitate a bond riot. I also, if I was advising folks, I would also say there might be other measures you could do in concert with this to try to reinforce the treasury market. And there are other policy proposals out there that are already in place to try to, take advantage of the fact that the U.S. government does have a lot of geopolitical heft to, bring additional buyers to our treasury market. So I think you would need to, if the game here is to stabilize U.S. geoeconomic position, reinforce the confidence of our treasury market, Bitcoin is not going to be one weird trick that just fixes it right by itself, right? I think it's a tool in a larger set of tools that if you're clever with economic statecraft and geopolitical signaling, then I think you could, extend U.S. American leadership, in a highly competitive environment.
Yeah,
it's not there's press the Bitcoin button and now everything is fixed.
Yeah, Bitcoin, the Bitcoin fixes meme. Yeah, well, it's a good meme, but in reality, again, it's probably not as easy as some people think it is. But yeah, interesting. I mean, that's exactly probably it. That there's some nuance to this, obviously. And it really depends on how exactly you pull this off, and if you do it prudently enough, then it could actually work. So, I mean, maybe for folks who are not following this discussion so close, I mean, I think things are going rapidly here, Can you maybe, towards the end now, sum up the most recent developments that we have been seeing? Is it in front of the Congress already? Is it presented to the president? How could something like this actually come true? And are we seeing some sort of steps being taken in that regard?
Yeah, so there's basic two ways that this could and is likely going to evolve. One is on the executive side. So the president has executive authorities to a certain extent to issue a state executive order, potentially, in his first days in office, that would create something that would be called a strategic Bitcoin reserve. And mechanically, one of the ways that he could legally do that is using his authorities that are already in law under the 1934 Gold Reserve Act, which gives the Secretary of the Treasury essentially broad powers to deal in gold, foreign exchange, or other instruments of credit or securities. And Bitcoin, of course, is not gold. It's maybe not foreign exchange, although there's maybe some debate about whether the El Salvador using it as a legal tender could qualify. But at least legal scholars, some analysis that I've looked into, probably the most legally justified mechanism is actually not buying gold, not buying Bitcoin outright, but essentially buying a Bitcoin denominated credit instrument, which is fully under the auspices of the Treasury Secretary's authority in the 1934 Gold Reserve Act, managing the assets held in the Exchange Stabilization Fund, which essentially is like the Treasury Secretary's kind of slush fund. That they could essentially buy a Bitcoin denominated bond as like an overnight maturity paid in Bitcoin, right? So maybe some delivery risk, right? In that sense, you have to like, really work out the contract with like, say a major exchange, right? Would be like, you're going to sell us a bond and it's going to essentially be redeemed the next day, right? In Bitcoin. And then you're going to hold that Bitcoin in an account, right? While we get our own custody and security arrangements, established. So mechanically, I think it's pretty feasible just under the existing law, the existing sort of facilities on the Exchange Stabilization Fund, that the U.S. government could establish like a starter position, right? Maybe a few $1 billion, right? But that would not be like, millions of Bitcoin, right? That would not be hundreds of, it'd be a starter position, and they could also take in, or announce their intent not to sell the existing Bitcoin held, right, from these seizures that are not like legally encumbered, right? So they're, sort of legally free and clear in the U.S. Marshal's account. So that's like the starter position on the executive side. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just quickly, I mean, what you just described, I mean, some people are already speculating that maybe Saylor could give a hand here, because like with the like Bitcoin denominated debt instruments, given he has such a big treasury, but I don't know, as you said, it's probably down to counterparty risk in the end, but it's just interesting. He would certainly be a proponent of this as well. And then maybe we'll see some future synergies there. Yeah, just something to throw in here.
I mean, I don't know how MicroStrategy shareholders would feel about that, because whether he gives up some of his Bitcoin for dollars in that sense, right? He's credibly said that he's never going to sell Bitcoin, right? So it would complicate his strategy there. It's possible he could get into that game. It seems cleaner just to have essentially someone like Coinbase or whatever, essentially be like, we're going to issue the structured product. It's very simple. It's got like very simple terms, right? And then, and then it gets redeemed automatically, just essentially it gets rebalanced on the books. Coinbase already has Coinbase custody. They can have a segregated account for the U.S. government. Well, of course, the U.S. government, really should do its own self-custody. But if you're trying to do this quick, establish this Bitcoin reserve, then maybe, you want to give time for, the NSA to help basically establish the cryptographic and physical security mechanisms, right, for like what would be like a digital version of like our Fort Knox. Right. And you want to like stress test that, you want to audit that, you'd want to really, the government, it's a new thing for the government to do, right? Right now, we contract out all of our Bitcoin custody, right? Like U.S. Marshal Service pays like Anchorage Digital or whoever else to like, actually hold our Bitcoin, right? The U.S. government doesn't actually hold any of it, like actual, physical custody.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So maybe we would, need to do that. So that would be a starter position. But then the real action in terms of a material and long-term establishment of an SBR would have to come through legislation, right? And so that's the Senator Lummis bill that she introduced over the summer, that she's announced her intention to sort of reintroduce at the first session of the new Congress, and is now essentially being circulated. And I think this will be like, the Senate is a deliberative body, right? So senators talk to other senators, and, they have to kind of educate, right? So I think there's going to be an education campaign inside the Senate. So even though the Republicans have like a 53-seat majority, it doesn't mean they're all on board with those Bitcoin reserve, right? By any means. So it's going to take, a lot of politicking, a lot of convincing to get, her Senate colleagues to, endorse the bill or vote for it if it comes up for a vote. And then the House, similarly, right? There's lots of debate about what should be the priorities with digital assets, whether it's a market structure bill, a stablecoin bill. That's been a lot of the momentum, especially on the House side, is to try to like finally put in place a regulatory framework around stablecoins and market structure, and that they want to lock those in. And so like, I know my diagnosis of this whole thing is that, a strategic Bitcoin reserve, again, we've had this like strategic level discussion. That's my orientation, is like, for the global system. But from like digital assets industry perspective, like, it would like boost the price of Bitcoin likely, but it doesn't really, if you're in the interest of, if you're trying to like IPO a stablecoin company, or you're trying to get like a bunch of your sort of fintech or crypto startups, to get a much more permissive regulatory environment, SPR maybe isn't your top priority, right? So I think politically there's a bit of debate happening even within the digital assets industry of exactly what's on top, like what should be first, what should be second. And I think, the sort of the Bitcoin community is like, we don't really care about a lot of this other stuff, right? We don't need special protections for Bitcoin. We don't need like the right to mine is already enshrined in law. We don't need like a special constitutional right to like, free speech and these sorts of business activities. We don't need like any special legal protections. But it would be important for the United States government to actually like establish a position so that it doesn't get front run by other countries, and that it creates this sort of strategic sort of positive loop for its long-term sustainability. So these are very different conversations, right? These are very different like policy priorities. And even though, the Republicans have a sweep, it's not clear to me like where the chips will fall when it comes down to like, the new Congress and exactly how much at the end of the day, I think this is going to come down to like what is presently brewing. I don't know. By the time this conversation goes live, it could be resolved, but like who's going to be the Treasury Secretary, right? There's at the time we're speaking, there's like a massive, sort of knife fight happening behind the scenes between a bunch of candidates, Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick. Recently, a bunch of other candidates have kind of come into play. It seems to be like a free for all. And the Treasury Secretary, as I just mentioned, would be the principal sort of executor of a strategic Bitcoin reserve. So who that person is, how favorable they are towards such an idea, is probably going to make the difference as to whether this, happens day one or whether it doesn't happen at all or whether somewhere in between.
Yeah, exactly. That's the discussion that everyone is following right now. But I mean, it's so interesting, as you said. In the end, I think it's really hard to pinpoint this. And it's there's a lot of variables that play into this. But I feel like, and this is maybe also my last question. Or at least a statement I want to make and ask if you agree. It almost feels like a certainty. That in some sort or way, some sort of way this will happen. I don't know how, but it feels like the momentum is here. And would you be agreeing that the probability is quite high that we will see some sort of SBR thing, however it's going to be implemented? But it feels like, in some sort of way or short of form should be there.
Yes, I would say before this Treasury sort of kerfuffle, when it was either Bessent or Lutnick, if it was Lutnick, I would have said it's a 99% you would get SBR. If it's Bessent, I would say it's like 60 to 75%. If it's somebody else,
still quite high, yeah.
If it's somebody else, then maybe it's like 50-50 because I just don't know, right? But I think there's a lot of momentum, a lot of like high level endorsement of this idea at the executive level. Handicapping the Congress in terms of establishing a certain strategic Bitcoin reserve of a certain size, like what's the handicap of whether the Lummis bill comes into law as written? It's probably going to be negotiated, right? It's a starting position. It's got like a sound basis, but she's going to have to win over her colleagues, and maybe 1 million is too much for them. Maybe it's not enough, but there's going to be a debate, right? So I would say it's more likely than not that we will get an executive established Bitcoin reserve. I would say at the moment, it had to be less likely than not, but still very plausible that we get a bill passed through Congress. But I think we're still very premature. This idea it's very new, right? It just kind of came into existence really as a serious policy proposal over the summer. Trump kind of, gave it a nod, but didn't really like give it a full-throated endorsement. He sort of established, we would establish a stockpile and we wouldn't sell anything. But it's not clear where he stands, right? Exactly on like the scale of this and how much political capital, he's willing to put down on this particular thing. He's going to have a lot on his plate January 20th. Right? They're going to have China, going to have the Middle East, going to have Russia, it's going to have God knows what, right? Come out of left field. And Bitcoiners like brought him the election. Many credibly can point to a lot of their activities and be like, hey, like we were there for you, right? And we have a certain vision that we think you can help, bring into being. Politics is politics, and leadership, attention can shift, right? And so I think there's going to be a sense of urgency, a sense of trying to lock in some things early on in the administration. But I mean, American politics is American politics, man. Like, crazy things happen. So it's crazy that we're even having this conversation to be in it, to be honest. Like, I would have, I think it's only possible to have this conversation because, the Republicans now have essentially all houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, and the presidency. But that doesn't mean there's sort of unanimity, right? Of like, even within the digital assets community of like, what should be the priority. Yeah, I'm not like I'm not like an activist here. I think I will make, I think sound, policy informed arguments. And then it's up to decision makers to decide, where they want to spend their political capital. I think it's a good thing. And I think it's also a potential risk. Like I look at this and I go, if we don't do this, or we don't do it, we don't really back it up, right? and the Middle East runs ahead of it, and then Hong Kong jumps in, then you could be in a very interesting, maybe downside scenario where we are trying to play catch up then, right? We then realize, oh, wait a second, a whole bunch of governments in the Middle East are spending hundreds of billions of dollars buying Bitcoin, right? Like, what are we doing about that, right? Do we go, hey guys, stop? Or do we go, maybe we should buy our own, right? And this is, I think it's very critical that we use all of our instruments of power to kind of like maximize our existing advantage.
Yeah, exactly. To me, this is one of the most convincing arguments, that, as you said, that the overtone window somehow maybe might be changing right now. And even if it has, then you just want to be on the right side of this. Otherwise, you will be left behind. And it's just another risk that you're basically running if you're now not following through with this. But yeah, Matthew, thanks a lot for all these great points for people to chew through. Definitely some great insights here. Maybe just one last question, maybe unrelated to this topic, even though it was a high signal talk. But do you know any other high signal person, that you could point us to that we should be talking about? Like any Bitcoin topic is fair game.
Well, certainly. And I'll pump the Bitcoin Policy Institute, where I'm a national security fellow and head of strategy. And I think we have an enormously deep bench of experts from a wide range of different fields. So any of them, I think, would be extremely high signal. I mean, just the folks that come to mind immediately is on the SBR side, two of my colleagues, Josh Hendrickson and Matt Ferranti. Matt Ferranti is actually an economist with the U.S. intelligence community. And Josh Hendrickson is the economics professor at Ole Miss. He's the chair of the economics department. And, they have,
Matt just co-authored a paper, right? Or he did write it, on the topic. I will certainly link to that one as well, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So Matt Ferranti, he got permission to write this paper, essentially the case for Bitcoin as a central bank reserve asset. So there you have a current serving economist at the intelligence community writing a paper that's making the case for Bitcoin as a central bank reserve asset. I'm just telling you, you should read that paper. That's on the pursuit of Bitcoin reserve side. On like the broader Bitcoin side, of course, fellows like Troy Cross, Andrew Bailey, Craig Warmke, Bradley Rettler. So the last three are kind of the resistance money trio. They wrote that amazing book, Resistance Money, which I think is like a must read for anyone that wants like an objective, analytic, rigorous analysis of Bitcoin, both its positives and negatives. And then
isn't Natalie Smolinski also associated with the institute?
Yeah, she's been a supporter. And she has also her own kind of the Texas, I forget what it's called. Texas group, and she's coming out with her book, the Satoshi Papers, which is kind of like
I heard about that. That's certainly something that would be interesting.
Yeah, and she gave I would point people to an amazing keynote address that she gave at the Bitcoin Policy Summit, which is the sort of major event that the Bitcoin Policy Institute puts on every year in DC. She gave like a opening keynote last year. It's on YouTube. Look it up. Really sort of a clarion call. The Bitcoin Policy will be putting on like another big summit. I expect now with this different political environment, it will be packed. We're going to define like a seriously, much larger venue this year. That should be like in April. So look out for that. If you're, policy inclined in the DC area, I think it'll be a marquee event.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks a lot for letting us know about all these things, Matthew. It was great talking to you. I feel like I could be going on and asking some more questions, but I want to be conscious of your time. And just thanks a lot for coming by and sharing all these great points with us. So have a great one, and maybe talk to you some other day again. Bye, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.